Hey guys, I'm Rashi Hamalio. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm reviewing for you Huda Beauty's new Naughty Nude palette. Now let's just have a look at the swatches first, and then I will give you my thoughts around this palette, whether I think it's worth the money. So just looking at the swatches, it's a pretty neutral palette. Most of the shades lean very much in that wine, burgundy, purple tones. It has a lot of those rose gold / mauve shades that you can see in this palette. Definitely a spin-off from the new Nude palette. Now, I never bought the original new Nude palette from Huda Beauty because it was too light. It just didn't have enough depth and it was too pink. I'm not really into pinks. So when I saw this palette, I was actually really excited because just looking at the swatches and of course the palette, it has a ton of depth. It has 3 solid shades to smoke out the outer V, and I love doing that. For me, smoking out the outer V is really important. I kind of do that every single time I do an eye look. And one of the limitations for most palettes is that you don't find enough shades that have that depth. This palette, I'm happy to say, has a lot of depth for medium to deep skin tones. I do have 2 different looks on my eyes today. They kind of look very similar, but we'll get into that in a minute. First, let me share with you my thoughts around this palette. I've been testing this palette out for the last 7 days straight. So every single day I've been doing an eye look with this palette, sometimes multiple looks using different combinations to really get a feel for this palette. And I feel like I've definitely cracked it. Let's start with the pros and then we're going to move on to the cons. Now the pros are that I love this color story. I think this color story is really beautiful. Burgundy tones, these deeper mauve shades look great on brown skin tones. So for me, when I saw it, I knew that the color story was for me. And because I don't have the new Nude palette, I thought this would be a great option for medium to deep skin tones. Mattes in this palette are beautiful. I've used every single matte shade and they're all apply beautifully. They're creamy, they blend easily. I mean, they're not creamy like your Natasha Denona creamy mattes. They're not like that creamy. They're more on the drier formula, but they definitely blend out very nicely. I didn't have any issues blending out these matte shades. There's also a really good proportion of matte to shimmer ratio in this palette, which is great because that just means you can get many, soul matte eye looks. You don't have to use the shimmers. You can actually get a few different eye looks that are completely matte. However, the mattes are rather monotone. They are very similar in tones, and so that has its own pros and cons. The pros being that you can layer them very easily and they will blend into each other and you'll get a very nicely blended eye look. However, it also means that you will have eye looks that more or less will look the same because they really are the same matte shades. For example, the eye I have on today, I actually have 2 completely different matte color stories going on my eye, but can you really tell a difference? It kind of just looks the same. So that really depends whether you think that's a pro or a con of this palette. But the mattes are beautiful and I love that she put a lot of mattes in here. The only matte shade that I really don't get much use out of is this shade here, Lucy. It's very, very light. It also has some really beautiful shimmer shades, like this irresistible shade right here. This is a shade I'm wearing on this eye, and it is really, really stunning. It has a lot of fallout, but it's a beautiful rose gold. I really enjoyed this shade. Then we have this shade right here called Shameless, and this is another it's like a cross between a shimmer shade and a scattered sparkle shade. It's quite interesting. It's got a very nice purpley lilac reflex. It's really beautiful, and I've got that today on this eye as a bit of a halo eye, and I have really enjoyed this shade. And then of course we've got this duochrome, which you would have seen from the swatches. This applies just as a swatches on the eye. It's beautiful. Also blends so nicely. This is one of the really standout shades. These 2 really for me are the standout shimmer shades from this palette. So now let's talk about the cons, because those were all the pros. The cons of this palette are, there's nothing wrong with the mattes. The mattes are beautiful. The shimmers though, apart from the 3 shimmers that I mentioned, I don't really like the rest of the shimmers. And one of the reasons is because they are very flaky. It's so annoying. Honestly, it is really annoying to work with the flaky shimmers because you can't really use a brush with them. You've got to use your finger, which is fine. I'm totally okay with using shimmers with my fingers. I always do that anyway. But when you pop them on the eye, they don't really smooth out evenly. They apply very flaky. There's a lot of texture on the eyelid. And then you try and smush it out and it becomes uneven. And then you've got to work a little bit harder to make that eye look even. And then the flakes will just come off and land all over your face. It's a bit of a mess. And I don't normally mind fallout with eyeshadows. I'm used to that. I'm used to having fallout with shimmer shades, but the problem with the flaky shades is there's extreme fallout and the texture that they leave behind on the eye. They leave this really sparkle texture that just sits on top of the eyelid, and when you're walking around just going about your day, that texture, that sparkle will just fall off on your face while you've got your makeup on. That's a bit annoying. So I'm really not a fan of the sparkle shades in this palette. And you know what, the flaky shades in this palette, and most of these shimmers, unfortunately, is the flaky formula. So for example, this tantric gold shade here, which is really beautiful but very flaky. I really don't like using it. Then you have Flower Power, that's flaky. You've got Please Me, that's flaky. Even this shade right here, Provocative, which doesn't look like it will be a flaky shade, that's flaky. And the problem with the flaky shades is that they kind of give a very, I don't want to say the word cheap, but they give a bit of a cheap look to the eye. They don't look beautiful in my opinion. For example, the shimmer shades in Natasha Denona palettes, I think are far superior. They're soft, they're creamy, they're buttery. You know, one swipe and you're not gonna get shimmers that are uneven at all. You're not gonna get flakes. You might get some flakes, but they're very easy to just blend with your finger and mush right in. Then you've got the Pat McGrath palette. These are not creamy or buttery shimmers at all, but again, they're not flaky. They apply beautifully on the eye. And even Huda's own palettes in the past. So I've got the Nude Obsessions medium. I don't have the light or the dark one. And the shimmer shades in this palette are also not as flaky as the Naughty Nude palette. So I'm not quite sure what happened there. I definitely prefer the shimmer shades in this palette right here. And pretty much the same goes with the Khaki palette. You guys know I love the Khaki palette. I think from color selection and the quality is pretty good in this palette. And I much prefer this over the Naughty Nude. So that's one issue I've had with this palette, is that I'm not really enjoying most of the shimmer shades, which is a shame because I love shimmer. Then we have 3 specific shades that are pretty much the same on the eye. So for example, Please Me, Irresistible, and Provocative. These are shades that pretty much look exactly the same on the eye. So I've tried them side by side and I couldn't tell a difference. When you look back and you look at your eye and you think, oh, it looks exactly the same. Why are they there? So I'm just gonna swatch them for you. So these are the 3 shades. Do you see what I mean? Of course they are different, but on the eye, all 3 of these shades, especially when you smoke out the other matte shades, and I've tried all of these 3 with different deep matte shades. I've tried it with Spicy, with Untamed, with the shade Naughty, and every single time they just look exactly the same on my eye. There's no difference, and so I get the same eye look each time. For a palette this expensive, that's not good enough in my opinion. And then this shade right here, this is, what is it called? Desire. Now this red shade, it looks quite pretty in the pan, and then I tried it on and it's okay. If you take a look at that, I mean, it is gorgeous, but I have better cranberry shades in my other palettes. The bronze palette has a better cranberry shade. The Pat McGrath has a better cranberry shade. Even Juvia's Place has a better cranberry shade. And what I mean by that, I'm going to swatch the Juvia's Place so you can see it side by side. I think you can see what I mean. So this right here is the Huda Beauty's cranberry shade, and this is Juvia's Place cranberry shade. I mean, look at that. That's a huge difference. The Juvia's Place has so much more impact and just that wow factor that the Huda kind of lacks. So I think it's a nice shade. It's just, if I'm wanting to do a cranberry eye, it's probably not the shade I'm going to reach for. Then we have this topper shade right here, which is Flower Power. I'm just not impressed with this shade either. It's also a very flaky shade, but as a topper shade, it just barely gives me anything. I mean, normally topper shades are not very pigmented. I'm okay with that. But even this on the eye on its own, there just isn't enough reflex, enough dimension to really do anything. So this shade just ends up looking flat. I much prefer Shameless right here, which is a cross between a topper shade and an eyeshadow. So you kind of get that reflex and that multi-dimension, and you get some pigmentation. It's beautiful, but Flower Power, not really. And then Tantric, of course. It's very flaky. I don't like it. Also this matte shade right here, which is interesting when you look at it in the pan, but when I apply it on my eye, and you'll see that from the eye tutorial, is it just looks okay on my skin tone. This shade just kind of blends into a shade that just gives me eye pigmentation. Like, if I hadn't slept well, that's how my eyes will look like. Do you know what I mean? So I think it would just look much better on lighter skin tones, to be honest. And then lastly, let's have a look at this slippery, slidey shade right here, which is the gloss shade. So there's a lot of interest about this shade. For me, it's just a gloss, but it's not a very good gloss. So you would expect from a gloss shade to have a lot of shine, but it doesn't. So I have worn this shade today. Actually, I had it on pretty much the whole day, and within a couple of hours of using this on top of a matte eye, the shine was gone. It's just not glossy, which defeats the purpose of a gloss shade. Now, a glossy shade will crease your eye, so my matte eye did crease, and I was expecting that, no problems there. But the fact that the glossy eye look was gone in like 2 hours. And even when I tried it on, I put quite a lot on. Even then, I couldn't really get this shade to build up. I couldn't really get it to really shine, and that was unfortunate. So I don't really understand the purpose of this shade. If it really gave some luminosity and some glossy lids, I think that would have been amazing, but it just doesn't. It doesn't. And when I want glossy lids, I'm not going to reach for this. I'm going to reach for my Becca Skin Glaze Stick. That one is amazing to give an eye a glossy appearance, and that looks very, very glossy. It does crease, of course, but it will definitely give me way, way more gloss. It also lasts a long time than this shade right here. So overall, I think this palette is average. It has some really good mattes, some good shimmers, but most of the shimmers I really didn't enjoy, and I just think it's really average, really, really average. And at this price tag, I would rather just purchase Natasha Denona palettes instead of this one. I think this palette had a lot of potential. I think perhaps if they didn't focus so much on the marble effects and the different types of textures, if they had just focused on creating really good quality shimmer shades, I think this palette would have been really good. But for me, it's not the color story that's problematic. For me, it's really the quality of the eyeshadows, specifically the flaky shimmers. And I do want you to take that with a grain of salt, because some of you may like the flaky shimmers. Some of you may not mind the flaky shimmers, and if that's the case, then I think you will probably really like this palette. But if you're someone who doesn't like that type of formula, just don't buy it. I don't think it's going to be worth it, because buying this palette just for the mattes, I think you'd be better off buying a Viseart palette, for example, that has great matte options. Now let me show you the two looks that I created with this palette, and then we'll circle back. So for this first look, I'm using the shade Hypnotic and applying that all over my eye and into the crease as well, just to prep my eyelid. Then I'm going in with the shade Hard, which is that marble matte shade, and you can see the color on my eyelid. I wasn't going to use this shade, but I thought I'd show it to you because it just looks like a weird brown on me. Then I'm just blending that out. It's really not the most flattering shade. Then I'm going in with the shade Untamed and using that in the outer V, and I'm just building that up slowly and focusing that up into the crease as well. And now I'm just blending that out. Now with this shade, it blended out very nicely. I didn't have any trouble blending out these mattes. They're really beautiful. Again, I'm just dipping back into Untamed and just slowly building up that intensity. Now I'm taking that shade and creating a bit of a halo eye and adding that to the inner corner as well, and giving that a final blend and applying that shade in the lower lash line as well. Then I'm going in with the shade Shameless, which is that beautiful purpley lilac shade, and focusing that into the middle of the eyelid. Now I'm going in with my second look before I finish off the other one, and I'm using the shade Arouse in the crease. Then I'm going in with the shade Naughty just in the outer corner, and I'm going to blend that out as well. Again, these matte shades do blend really nicely. Now I'm going back in with the shade Spicy just to add a little bit more depth to the outer V. Even with this shade, it's the darkest shade in the palette, and I didn't have too much trouble blending this shade out, so I quite enjoyed working with these mattes. Now I'm using the shade Spicy in the lower lash line, and now topping off my lid with the shade Irresistible, which is a beautiful, deeper, mauve-ish rose gold shade. It has less gold and more mauve. Now I'm just going back in with Spicy in the outer V just to make sure it stands out a little bit more. And this is the final look for both my eyes. Overall, they kind of look similar, but I do really enjoy these matte shades, and then these two very specific shimmer shades are also really gorgeous, and I enjoyed creating both of these looks. By the way, I just want to mention that for those of you who already own a lot of the Huda Beauty palettes, if you have, for example, the 3 Nude Obsessions palette, and you probably have the new Nude, then really there's no reason why you need to buy this palette, because a lot of these shades are actually in those palettes. So I think save your money on that. I really hope you enjoyed this video and found this review valuable. If you did, please leave a comment below, and I will see you guys in my next video. See ya!